This is lecture 7 for your introduction to philosophy, and in this lecture we'll be looking at the philosophy of the early Stoics.
The first thing to note about Stoicism is that it emerges as a reactionary philosophy against the movement of hedonism. Hedonism, by definition, is the search for pleasure as the key to happiness, especially sensual or sensible pleasure. Our primary example is Aristippus. Aristippus argues for a form of hedonism that emphasizes quantity over quality. In other words, you should try to hoard or collect, experience as much pleasure as possible without focusing so much on how high a quality the pleasure is. Ironically, Aristippus began as one of the students of Socrates, but he soon grew into disfavor with his fellow students for taking the path of the sophist and traveling all over the area and charging very large fees, exorbitant fees, for his teaching that pleasure is the greatest good in life. Now, Epicurus, who is pictured here, is often wrongly accused of being an all-out hedonist like Aristippus was, but he offers a much more nuanced, unique view of seeking after pleasure. Epicurus argues that focusing on the quantity, the amount of pleasure you can accumulate, could actually numb your senses. It could be so much of a sensory overload that you numb yourself to even being able to enjoy the pleasures anymore. An example here would be the pleasure of relaxation that you may gain through drinking alcohol, but then of course the consequence of that throughout a lifetime of drinking can be becoming an alcoholic, where you have to try to drink more and more just not to feel sick and no longer have the pleasure. And so here we have Epicurus emphasizing the quality of particular pleasures rather than the amount of pleasure that you can accumulate. Now, as our primary reaction against hedonism or even Epicureanism is going to be Stoicism. The very first philosopher to begin making Stoic arguments was Zeno. This is seen as coming from a cynical school of philosophies, in other words, being cynical about a society that is focused simply on pleasure. Some of our earliest Stoics are Antisthenes and Diogenes. Diogenes is pictured here, and their argument was that if you spend your entire life seeking after pleasure, it will soften your mind, and if you have an entire society, an entire city or empire focused simply on pleasure, that will weaken that civilization and will inevitably bring about the fall of that society, will bring about the destruction of that empire. That will be many of the arguments that will later be made about the fall of Rome. Now, the philosophy of Stoicism that emerges from Antisthenes and his prize pupil Diogenes emphasizes, instead of pleasure, self-denial and self-sacrifice. As you can see in the picture of Diogenes here, his life of sacrifice. He lives in a hollowed-out cistern there, and the legend that always tied to Diogenes is that he lived with several stray dogs, and so you also see that pictured here. Now, Stoicism has a heavy emphasis upon discipline, and the purpose of that discipline is to prepare you for the suffering and pain that is part of the universal human experience. If you have learned to live simply without expectation of pleasure, then you have a soul that will be prepared to cope with life's inevitable difficulties. So you can be thankful for the good things, thankful for pleasure, but if that becomes your focus, your life is easily going to become unraveled if and when you fall upon difficult times. One of the ironies of Stoicism is how it attracts people from very different walks of life, and that's what we see addressed on this slide. Epictetus was a former slave, a very, very poor man, lived in poverty, and he followed the Stoic route, and that would make a lot of sense with what we've just heard about Stoicism. But on the other hand, Marcus Aurelius, who was actually the emperor of the Roman Empire, and so one of the wealthiest men of his time, he also was very committed to the path of Stoicism. Now, one of the primary teachings of Epictetus that becomes very important to Stoicism is that Epictetus taught that the Stoic is ultimately a scout, one who is to go out into the world, observe the world, and then return back to his people to report to them what his findings were. And the most important observation that Epictetus ever wrote is that in able to live a balanced and good life, we have to be able to discern between what it is we can control and what it is that we cannot control. And only once that we're able to tell the difference between those two things can we then commit ourselves to the discipline of no longer being anxious about the things that are beyond our control, because again, we can only have influence over some things in our lives and very little control over most things. Now, Marcus Aurelius is the one who's actually pictured here on this slide, and for being an emperor, he was quite a humble person. If any of you have ever seen the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe, the emperor, the elderly emperor at the beginning of that movie, who dies very early in that movie, is Marcus Aurelius. He was known for being quite a philosopher king, similar to what we saw described in some of Plato's writings. Marcus Aurelius was also known for disciplining himself to treat others fairly, even if they'd committed wrongs against him. He believed that each and every person, each and every soul, had a particular fate, a particular place that life was supposed to fall into. And so some of the rumors were that he had men who had slept with his wife, but if he felt that they could fulfill a responsibility in government, he did not hold that fault against them, but instead he saw it as their fate and would give them whatever that particular position was. And we're going to say more about fate and destiny on the next slide. Okay, as we come into talking about fate, we need to go back to the concept called the logos that we discussed on an earlier lecture. Remember that for the ancient Greeks and later the Roman philosophers, the logos was an impersonal force or energy that actually holds the entire cosmos, the entire universe, together. Now, the Stoics also believed that the logos moved all things in the universe toward a predetermined end, and that's what we mean by fate, that the logos has a predetermined end for each and every person. And so Stoicism presents a picture of our lives in which just about everything is out of our control. And again, as I mentioned on the earlier slide, we can certainly have some influence on things. This was an important teaching of Epictetus, that even though we can control very few things, we can influence some things. But according to Stoicism, if we are fated to a particular end, this does mean that the courses of our lives have already been predetermined. Now, something not addressed to much extent in your textbook, it's talked about a little bit, is the enormous influence that this teaching would end up having on some religious views of the time, most especially the emerging religion of Christianity. Christianity actually takes this concept of the logos and teaches that the logos is not impersonal, but is personal. And in fact, the logos is not only personal, but the logos becomes a person. And so for Christianity, the logos was seen as equivalent to the personal figure referred to as God. So rather than teaching fatalism, that it's an impersonal force that's driving lives, this religion will begin teaching, of borrowing from the Stoics somewhat, this idea of not an impersonal fate, but instead a teaching of destiny, that there is a personal being that has actually put forth a path for our lives. And again, like the Stoics, some things on that path will be out of our control, but there are certainly other things that we can influence. And this gets into the entire argument within religion about free will, predestination, and all of those sort of things. So you may have heard some of those things before, but may not have been aware that it's tied in directly to a lot of what the Stoics were teaching.